If there's one subject matter that I think is severely, severely underrated in the art community, it would be still lifes. Having an absolute blast lately setting up and painting still lifes, and today in this video I want to walk you through how to set up your own still life just using the stuff that you have lying around to make a quick, easy painting that is actually just a blast to work through. The way that I assemble still lifes is actually pretty straightforward. I really just try to get like a collection of random shapes, sometimes in a similar color palette, and I fiddle with the arrangement until I feel like it's right. The things that I look for in terms of composition, I want something not in the dead center. I try to not have a lot of white space surrounding the center of my painting. I like to have focal points in different areas. Ideally, there are shapes that are running off the edges. Not everything is contained within the frame, so to speak. I also look for a lot of interesting textures and really deep shadows and bright highlights. Having that vivid kind of contrast is really great for me as a beginner because I can use the highlights and the dark values to map out the image without having to rely on my, at the moment, kind of subpar drawing skills. I can sort of sculpt the piece as it goes, using those darks to render a more three-dimensional kind of form. And when I do a sort of photo shoot kind of session for my still lifes, I like to do a bunch of different setups all at once, try to figure out what works best for me, because I like to have a huge library of images to pull from later on when I'm ready to paint. It was a pretty overcast day when I was doing this photo shoot, but I actually really recommend that you look for a bright and sunny day. An overcast day can sort of soften all of that contrast that I just talked about that's really actually very valuable. Similar to beauty photo references, if there's no contrast on the face, if the lighting is like coming right in front of you from a ring light or something, there are no shadows and the image can look very flat if you're trying to paint a portrait that way. Similar to a lot of movies, or the way that I'm filming right now even, I have a light coming from one side and I'm filming from the shadow side of my face. This is a technique used in cinema and it just makes the face look more three-dimensional. Shadows and highlights are really, really important to be able to correctly map out your values. Having the blackest black near the lightest light is a technique used in a lot of paintings to make it look really vivid, really interesting. It constantly draws in your eye. I actually used this cellophane bag that the carrots were contained in because I think it actually had a lot of really interesting textures. But directly next to those carrots, there's a huge shadow space. I thought that was actually a really interesting composition, and there were so many colors playing with that cellophane bag that I thought it would be a really interesting thing to try and paint and render, because plastic bags are sort of notoriously difficult to paint because they don't have those same shadows that I was talking about inside of them. I thought it would be an interesting challenge that he juxtaposed with the dark stuff that you see in the rest of that composition there. Another thing that I advise you to do when composing your still life is to try and get lots of interesting textures. As you can see, I talked about that cellophane bag and I also use the carrots, but I bring in the garlic too. And I think that has a really interesting, like, flaky kind of texture that could be a challenge to interpret in paint. And then there are tons of textures in this image overall. We have the wood of the table that you can sometimes sort of see. You have the wood of the cutting board even. There are just tons of textures involved in this image, and I think it creates a really dynamic composition that would be a challenge, but sort of elevating it beyond the typical, more boring reputation that still lifes have because you're just bringing in so many different things. I think how boring a still life is completely up to you depending on your setup. You can make things really, really interesting if you just bring in a few, like, sort of surprising objects. I use food for this video, but you totally don't have to. If you had a bunch of like Y2K 1990s like Tamagotchis or sunglasses or like necklaces or something, you could totally do that too. It is completely up to you. Use whatever you have lying around. And I think when you're composing it and trying to figure out a composition that works really well for you, you'll learn a lot about how to compose your paintings, what things you look for, and what you actually like to paint. As I compose the still life, I learn more about what I value in my paintings, what I want to emphasize, the kind of colors that I want to bring in. You'll learn a lot about what you think works well together as you go through this process. And when you have your still life completely ready to go, it's all assembled, I take a bunch of photos from a variety of angles. For a good chunk of the photos, I used just my phone. I have an iPhone 11, and I actually then pivoted to this Canon M50 that I'm recording on right now to capture like some B-roll kinds of footage, but I can import that footage into Final Cut Pro and extract stills as photos later if I want to, and I think the M50 gets a little bit more detail, it's a little bit more crisp kind of footage. I think the shadows are a little bit more vivid, and overall it's just slightly better image quality. Again, do whatever you want, use whatever you have around. There is no need to get anything fancy for this kind of setup. I like to keep my painting sessions for these still life paintings to like an hour and a half, not much longer. And I think that the time constraint helps me loosen up quite a bit. It helps me take more risks, like I talked about earlier, and it just overall helps me stop being such a perfectionist. My biggest problem with painting, I think, is that I just overwork stuff. I second guess myself and I make bad decisions in the heat of the moment. Setting a time constraint sort of eliminates those problems, and it makes me make more like gut decisions about things that I think actually work very well in practice. But that's it for this video. I hope you guys learned a lot about setting up your still lives, and I hope you have fun setting up a still life of your own, and I hope to see you again here soon. I'll see you guys later. Bye.